to the Art of Arms podcast, where we discuss the intricacies of historical fencing. Today's guest is Alexander Fürgut.
Welcome, Alexander Fürgut. This is going to be an interesting episode. Alexander is the author of the Schielhau in detail. It's a book about the Schielhau.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. So, Alexander, before we kind of get into the book, which, for full disclosure, you sent me a copy to review and to do this podcast and have this conversation, which I'm grateful for. It's a beautiful book. I guess we can start by talking about the layout and the editing of it. It's probably for a modern design perspective, it's one of the most interesting and well composed books that I've seen. It's really nice.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about your martial arts background and how you got started into HEMA?
All right. So I started in 2011. Basically, a friend of mine did some reenactment, and he did HEMA many years before that, and he wanted to get back into it. So he asked some of his reenactment group if he wanted to learn some sword fighting, and me. Turns out the reenactment folks did not enjoy the sport. And actually get ready and so on as much. So pretty soon most of them were out, and it was me, him, and like one or two other guys from his group. And yeah, from there everything started. I liked it. I stick with it. We got new people who were interested in people doing sword stuff. So that's kind of how I started in HEMA.
Very cool.
And let's say for the first 10 years, I focused solely, well, not solely, but mostly on longsword. Like I did a couple of workshops here and there and tried out stuff for a couple of times, but that was the main focus. Then let's say after COVID, I switched to rapier as my main focus. But yeah, I still teach longsword here in Ulm, which is in South Germany.
Very cool. Who's your favorite rapier master? Who do you study the most?
So the first book we read was Giganti, and actually we like him a lot because he's very concise, to the point, nothing fancy. Like I cannot do Fabrice poses for most of the time. I'm not flexible enough. But Giganti is like, yeah, stand up right, lean back a little bit, and just take it from there. Very practical, and yeah, it's still one of my favorite rapier books.
Yeah, no, I like Niccolo Giganti a lot. I find myself quoting Niccolo Giganti more and more to the point where. It's funny. I wrote an article recently about sort of the spheres of influence. There was a section of it, but it was about interpretation. And one of the things that I was talking about is how typically you want to look from like the past or the present first when you're trying to find holes in something to kind of build your interpretation, and then you look more towards the future to see how it developed. I can't help myself but find Giganti just is so on the point when it comes to a lot of things. He's just he's really good.
I have not read him in the original Italian, but at least I think it's Tom Leone's translation. He's like the language is very concise, not flowery. It's just very practical applies. Like somebody standing right next to you in the tavern, giving you, you need to do this and this and that if someone does this, because this happens.
Yeah, and that's also kind of the power of Tom Leone as a translator too. He's so good at kind of creating his interpretations around modern language. So, you're a very, proficient English speaker. So, I think hearing like the way that Tom Leone translates, because sometimes he does cut out the flowery stuff. Like if you compare his Manciolino to Swinger's Manciolino, Swinger's Manciolino still has the stuff where he's like cut through his face and, like some of the more brutal aspects of Manciolino's language that Leone just totally cuts out. He's just like, yeah, cut a vendetta to his head, so every once in a while he's a little bit more utilitarian, I guess, in his translations, which is really nice. But so where exactly do you live in Germany?
Yeah, so Ulm is a city. It's around 200,000 inhabitants, so it's not the smallest one, but a lot of people don't know it because it's, let's say, halfway between Stuttgart and Munich. So Munich, Oktoberfest Munich, which is in the south. Yeah. And usually those cities take more of the spotlight, so the smaller cities around them are kind of forgotten if you're not from around here. So that's kind of where I am, right at the border of Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg.
So if you had to choose between FC Bayern and VfB Stuttgart, who would you choose?
I have absolutely no clue about soccer.
Oh, come on.
Or whatever you want to call it. Like, I have never even watched the full match, so I can't really tell you anything about it.
It's one of my favorite things to do when I watch football is, because I'm a big Bayern Munich fan. That's the only reason I asked.
Oh, I see.
Is to watch for the 5 words in soccer or in football. Right. So you look for where they're trying to strengthen so that way they can weaken, or weaken so that way they can strengthen and kind of push up the field. It's kind of fun. I picked that up from Adam Franti. He was like, you can see the 5 words and everything, and that's basically the way that I watch sports now. It's kind of fun.
A little anecdote: if I drive to Munich from here, the next big city that I come through is Augsburg. So we all know that Paul Hector Meyer, treasury master, embezzling a bit of money to write his SEMA manuscript on the side. yeah. Well, and Achille Marazzo's student, Giacomo Crafter, or Jacob Crafter, in German. He was from Augsburg. They were a trading family from Augsburg, the Crafter family, originally from Scotland. So he's like a second generation. He's a first generation German. So his dad was Scottish nobility, and then they moved to Augsburg and started a trading company there. It's pretty interesting. Yeah. I mean, Augsburg is not that important in today's Germany. Like, it's not one of the major centers. It's still a middle range city, but back then, it was a bit different.
It was huge. I mean, you had the Fuggers, and you had, I mean, it was sort of the center of trade. It was a lot like, I don't know, you could relate it to a city like probably like Chicago or New York in the Renaissance. A lot of big money, but also, money tends to follow money in certain areas. So there's always economic opportunities there. I mean, the Fuggers were such a big banking family and trading family. Being a trader would be big business. There's always opportunity there. So
and there's always geography where you're nicely situated on all the trade routes going to Milan and so on.
Yeah. I mean, you're the first stop out of the Alps, right? I mean, isn't that also where Talhofer got in trouble? He was just south of Augsburg when he murdered that guy.
Yeah, it was somewhere around that area. So a lot of stuff happened here in the south, I guess.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's an incredibly fascinating place from a historical perspective, which is a lot of fun. All right, so let's dive into the Schielhau a little bit. So, it's really funny. I really enjoyed your book. I think that you and I see fencing very similarly, from a perspective of, I think it's really clear that your focus, especially from reading this book, is about body mechanics, structure, and I mean, there's the whole middle portion of the book is body mechanics and structure.
Yeah, pretty much.
And I really love your explanation of how to sort of check your structure and really kind of like engage with structure. That's one of the things I'm a big stickler for when I'm teaching my students, or even when I'm fencing. It's something that I'm always paying attention to in my own fencing is, did that fail because my structure failed in some way, basically, right? And I'm always trying to fence with structure. And I can see how that influences your interpretation, which is also really interesting because you and I have the same interpretation for the Schielhau.
Okay.
So this could be a very boring podcast because I agree with you on so many different levels. But in order to kind of, make it a little bit more interesting, I did ask for some dissenting opinions on your interpretation of the Schielhau, and see if I could get some people to just provide some questions that were not in line with how I think, if that makes sense.
But as you read the book, you that was one of the things I thought about, like, even if you do not agree with the interpretation, like you say, this is not the way I do the Schielhau, how do I have to write a book so that people would still get something from it? Because even though if you do not agree that this is a Schielhau, you could still write it and say, okay, whatever this thing is called, it might be still useful, and there's still useful tips with it. And that was really, let's say, at the front of my mind when I started it, because I've made the experience a lot of times you talk with someone, and at a point where you see, okay, you're doing things differently, it can go either one of two ways. The one way is that you say, okay, we agree to disagree, but then you go into the details, like, why do you do this like this and not this? What is the advantage, disadvantage? That's really good, because that's a learning opportunity and you get something from it, even if you do not disagree in the core premise. But other times it's just gets into like, you're wrong, I'm right, I'm trying to convince you, and nothing is learned here. And those discussions go nowhere.
Right. Yeah, it is interesting, right? I mean, a lot of times when you show somebody and they can see it for themselves, you can see their opinions start to soften a little bit, right? Because they're like, oh, this does work. I can start to see why you would do it this way. And, in that article that I wrote recently about coming up with textual interpretations, one of the things that I discussed was sort of the allowing for technique and principle to sort of come together in harmony. And I think that's one of the key things that you want to really see in fencing is you want to make sure that your technical application of whatever it is that's written in the text is also based on principle. And I think, and you can correct me if you see it differently, but from reading your interpretation of the Schielhau, one of the things that I really like is you come to a strong position first. So you come to a position where you're in control of your opponent's sword. Their sword is fallen into your cross guard with that 30 to 45 degree angle. Yep. And then you come forward with that false edge. And so right now I'm taking my students through Andre Lignitzer and through 133. So I primarily teach sword and buckler, but and it's pretty fascinating because looking at Lignitzer's Schielhau and the way that he does it, especially when you're using a shorter sword, you're using an arming sword.
Yeah.
The sort of the moment that you have to really kind of get that Schielhau in there, and where he talks about you kind of stand in two shields, and then you kind of fall over with the short edge, it's pretty interesting. If you don't actually gain the opponent's sword prior, even with a buckler in your hand, right? Like you think, oh, I've got a buckler in my hand, so I can protect my hand really well.
Too
right?
risky, just too risky.
It is too risky. Like you still, like, even if I were to have my buckler up there and I were to, let's say, perform a Schielhau with just the short edge, the thing that always ends up happening, if I were to go with that interpretation, is basically their sword just falls on the elbow of my buckler hand, right? Because it's just going to bounce off. And so, for me in particular, I mean, obviously I come from much more of a Bolognese focus when it comes to my fencing interpretations and practice, right? So my interpretations are definitely colored by an Italian sense of fencing. And so, yeah, I've kind of found that picking up with the long edge and sort of creating that pocket to catch their sword, and then coming up with the short edge after you've picked them up in that pocket is really nice. So yeah, go ahead.
I mean, the way I'm thinking about it is, well, for one, the techniques need to be able to be done safely. So safely in the sense that you are very well protected. And it's not only that it's safe when you do it absolutely perfectly, but you need some error tolerance. So you're not doing everything perfectly each time. The opponent does things slightly differently. So you need to have some flexibility built in all of your approaches. Otherwise, it's like, oh, I got it 99% perfect, but that's not good enough. I got hit anyway. That's not good enough. And one thing I talk about with the way I do the Schielhau, like this is not even specific to this interpretation. You can do this with many things. You try to get, either you get the bind before you do the stepping, so your body is out of range, or you get as close enough as you can to getting the bind, which is because against more experienced opponents, they won't just let you get the bind, but you still can get closer to it and see, okay, this is their reaction. Now, can I do the step safely? And of course, it's never 100% sure, but thinking about this and building it into your ideas and approaches, that you need to be able to a little bit at least see what your opponent is doing, how he's reacting to whatever you're trying to do, and you need to be able to then change your whatever you're doing. That alone makes a lot of stuff a lot safer. And yeah, so if you combine that with a good body structure and a good approach, where like, I mean, I'm a tall guy. I do not have the problem that people are coming from above with a lot of force, but it needs to work for smaller people as well. And the only thing to do that against someone who is a lot stronger than you is if you have a very good body structure and even more fault tolerance, because being outmatched from a strength point, you need even more things stacked in your favor, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so I think what's really interesting is that there's so when I'm talking about like a strong position, I like what I really enjoy about the way that you do it, and sort of what kind of led me to the similar interpretation is I'm always seeking to control my opponent's sword, right? Like, I mean, that's sort of the crux of fencing. And I think in a lot of interpretations of KDF, especially sort of the old guard interpretations of KDF, there's a lot of, well, I should be able to do this in a single tempo. It should be one fluid action for every Meisterhau, right? If we're borrowing Joachim Meyer's term here. And where I find fault with that is that a lot of times that leads to a lot of doubles, right? There's no attempt a lot of times to control the opponent's weapon and what it is that they're doing. Whereas, like with your interpretation, you're getting their sword first. You're sort of coming to a strong position, and in the same tempo, like, I mean, you're not even done with your motion yet, right? Like, all you've really engaged is your hips and your shoulders, right? So your hips and your shoulders are starting the action, and then your hands finish the action, right? So to me, that's all one tempo already, right? If I was using a very strict, like, Italian variation of the word tempo, I think that any Italian master would say that's a tempo. So because you've initiated with your body and you're finishing with your hands. So I guess when it comes to like the other Meisterhau, I see something very similar, right? So like, even if you look at the Zornhau, obviously the Zornhau comes to a strong position. It's sort of a shortened position before you come forward with your with your point. Yep. I think the Schielhau is probably the only one that doesn't. It's just a very long action. And then, but with this Fürgut, I see it very similarly, where you're still trying to come to a strong position, and that's sort of facilitated through both mechanical advantage, but also biomechanical advantage if you really build your structure behind your sphere.
Yeah. So the way I think about it is you should be able to do both things. Like you should have those lightning fast strikes that go as like, and then you're in. Because sometimes that's the right thing to do. Like you have fenced a bit with your opponent, you know his reactions, you can gauge whatever he's doing. It's the perfect opportunity. You just go in and you don't double because you catch the blade. But other times you need to stretch that out a little bit. Like you need to be able to make that just a tiny bit longer so that you get a better feel for, okay, what is he doing? And that's exactly the thing I'm doing here. And it's the same thing with the other strikes here. I do definitely agree with you here, because if you try to always just go in one strike as fast as you can, that's you're guessing a lot. So
and sometimes exactly.
Yeah. And sometimes you guess right and sometimes not, but you also need to be able to draw that out a little bit, and you can vary the tempo or the way you're doing it. Like you can start out slowly, build over time, and then finish really fast, or you can go a little bit slower than you could at your maximum, but keep it consistent. You can do different things depending on what you're wanting to do, and I think that's part of mastering a strike, that you know when to use these little variations that might seem very similar from the outside, but make a huge difference if you're fencing against someone who is closer to your own level. Like against beginners, you can do anything anyway, but against the good people, you need to be able to use everything you can to get an advantage.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's actually an Antonio Manciolino quote where he says that when you recognize that your opponent is of equal skill, that you should seek to strike them in contratempo, right? So his idea is that you shouldn't actually, like your baseline of fencing, right? So if we think about this as I'm fencing a completely new person, you get a feel for how that person fences before you recognize, like when you recognize that your sort of, we could call this almost like a mesotempo action. When you recognize that your mesotempo action is, hold on one second. So that mesotempo action versus sort of contratempo, like you think about mesotempo being this, there might be sort of a half tempo that's built into the action. I think you represent that pretty well with sort of describing the Schielhau as sort of happening on that half step and then sort of finishing with the half step initiates with the turn of the hips. And then the arms extend when you're going in for the strike, right?
Usually the arms extend first, and while you're doing that, you do turn the upper body. But the upper body is first and then follows the step. And you can really do that really close together, to kind of snap it in, or you can draw this out a bit more if you need more time to see what your opponent is doing.
Yeah, so I would think like the more drawn out one would be like mesotempo, and then a really quick, snappy one would be contratempo. So for those uninitiated,
yeah, I think that would fit. That would be a fair description.
Yeah. So I think one thing that I thought was really interesting in the book about that, speaking of hips and shoulders, I know that with a lot in KDF, there's you usually have the right foot behind the left foot forward, and you're passing with the right foot to execute the technique. One of the things that I would just recommend is you do a really good job in your images showing the function of the turn of the hips and the shoulders, but you don't talk about how that relates specifically to like building that biomechanical advantage behind what it is that you're doing. And I can even see it in your feet, where like when you're kind of on that half step, your foot is sort of up, you're up on the ball of the foot as it's kind of approaching to sort of past the lead foot. And the hips are starting to turn and the shoulders are starting to turn as you're kind of coming to that strong place. And then you finish with the step. That's just the one thing. But because you illustrate it really well. Like I can see it in your body mechanics, like from the pictures that you took. But I don't know if it was...
How would you describe it, or how would you explain it?
I would kind of explain it as... the hips and the shoulders are always going to kind of lead, right? So like Lichtenauer talks about always fencing with the fullness of your body. Mm-hmm. So when you're in that starting position and you have your left foot forward, your hips are going to be facing towards the right? Yep. So like, let's take the step out of it completely, right? So let's forget the fact that there's a step. And let's say somebody catches you off guard and you don't have time to step, or the measure isn't quite right for you to step. I would say that, from that sort of hips profile to the side perspective, you're going to sort of start by turning onto the ball of the back foot, which is going to allow you to turn your hips and shoulders and basically square your hips and shoulders with your opponent. And then from there, that's the full hip turn, right? And then from there, that's where the arms can then extend forward, right? So one of the things that I always kind of think about with longsword in particular is that your left arm, when you're holding a longsword, is always your longest arm, which is the opposite of what you would have if you had like a single-handed sword, right? So if I had my hips off to the side, and I was sort of facing the right, if my chest and my hips were facing the right when I was in that stance, my left arm is my longest arm, right? But if I'm holding just a single-handed sword, then my right arm is my shortest arm. So that's where I think that the mechanics of a longsword are super interesting. And in my own world, my own little universe, when it comes to Marazzo, I think that a lot of his techniques and the way that he describes things are predicated on that. I think that you end up reversing a lot of his techniques to the left side when you're translating the Bolognese fencing system from a right-handed focus to a left-handed focus, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. The hip and upper body rotations are an important part of the system. I think it's with the Schielhau it becomes super clear because the people who can do really fast swerves always have a very good upper body motion. And their whole core and everything, just the body structure from the toe to the head is just perfectly aligned to do those fast rotations. Yeah.
I always tell my students that if they're not shaking it like Shakira, then they're not fencing correctly. But it kind of getting back to that sense of strength. There's a quote from Joachim Meyer that I came across the other day. I was looking for something, and in speaking of the Wehrleger, he talks about how there's this element of in Bolognese fencing. This is made very clear, especially through Angelo Vigiani. But I don't know how clear or how well defined it is within KDF. It's not something that I hear discussed a lot. But there's this notion of offensive and defensive guards.
Yeah, that's not really like in the older text. That's not much of a thing. It's just like there are only 4 guards. Then you get a bonus guard of long point in the end, but it's not differentiated. And this is offensive. This is defensive. It's more like. If you read something about those lines, it's usually the Nürnberger Hausbuch tip, like be on the offensive, grab the 4, be in the 4, but it's not... the techniques itself are from the 4 and from the Nach, so offensive, defensively oriented, but not the guards themselves. Yeah.
So one thing that I found was interesting. So one of my students and I have kind of gone down this rabbit hole a little bit, but Meyer makes a statement that he says, first of all, the ancients not only used the 4 guards for good in attacking, which kind of implies that there's an attacking, there's sort of a bias towards attacking, right? So not only for the good in attacking, kind of implies that he means that they're meant for attacking, right? And that's
you
what the
certainly see
Wehrleger.
it when people learn fencing nowadays, that their doubling
Right.
machines are just attack.
Exactly, right. And then he says, but also hid are so-called fencing, which to me, fencing, at least, again, the way that the Italians define it, when you talk about fencing, a lot of times you're talking about defense. Summarily in them is how he concludes that quote, which I think is really interesting because I think, Lager is a term that was generally used to like kind of drive an animal out of a cave when you're using hunting terminology. Whereas hoot, if you think about like a hoot, that's something that you would say would be like a shelter or sort of some sort of a protective environment.
Oh, you mean in the Hütte house kind of way?
Yeah. So like if I was in Wechselhut, for example,
Yeah.
I'm in a defensive guard. So I don't know if that's a thing. You can go down that rabbit trail. Like I said, KDF, as fascinated as I am with German fencing, I think it's interesting that there's sort of this etymological notion that there are offensive and defensive guards there. But what I do think is pretty fascinating is because of the fact that the Wehrleger are the four guards that most people will hold because that's what they tell you to do in the KDF tradition, there's this bias towards offense. And so what we see is offensive fencing, like you kind of pointed out, because that's kind of their nature. Like you're naturally going to start to go into that versus people, they're holding guards that are inclined towards offense that have the defense built into them. Right. And we see that through the Meisterhau, right, where they can be used offensively and defensively.
Yeah. I mean, you have that whole point about you cannot protect yourself without danger. Sie schützt kein Mann ohne Gefahr, where you say, okay, if you're in a guard, there's always some opening somewhere. And I remember, like, let's go back 10 years ago or something like that, where this notion of, you need the four. The four is the thing. If you're doing Lichtenauer stuff, take the four. And you had a lot of people going, both of them going to the four, doubling a lot. I think that's kind of changed after a while when people said or experienced, maybe defending and then counterattacking. So Parade, Riposte in modern terminology is not that bad of a thing because it kind of does often work. Or at least you need to have to defend yourself more often because you need to figure out what the opponent is doing, how he's behaving before you can do those great one action techniques where you get the hits, defend yourself perfectly. Because if I do not know anything about you, you can do 1,000 different things to mess up my timing and my body structure and whatever. And I need to kind of figure out that first. And to do that, I need to see you in action, but I need to not get hit by it, ideally. So,
right. Yeah. And that's one of the strengths that I see with your interpretation of the Schielhau, right? Is you can get a really good sense of how your opponent is going to fence and then act, use the 5 words to act. You can use Fueling. You'll get Fueling right away. Like there's a built-in Fueling mechanism if you kind of go to that strong place first, where you'll know and you can act sort of, there's also the notion from 3227A of frequens modus, where like if you're strengthening, your opponent is striking an Oberhau, right? So let's say that they're striking an Oberhau and their end point is going to be long point. If you start to go to that strong position first and they decide to cut an Oberabnehmen and they just decide to cut around, right?
yeah.
You can go ahead and you can modify that reaction, right? Like you can start going into your Schiel and then you can perform a Zornort, or I mean not a Zornort, but a Sverkau, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it depends on how fast or when he wants to do it. Because if he waits too long, you can just finish the Schielhau, have his perfectly in your blade, and he cannot just cut around because your blade is in the way. But if he's super twitchy and going very early, then you will not. It's probably not the best idea to just finish the Schielhau anyway, because then probably you're just going with the hands forward. Oh, he's already doing something, even if I'm not that close to him with my blade. So yeah, now I should probably step back, do a defensive motion or whatever, and try again next time. But now I know if this is his tendency, maybe the Schielhau is not the best option if he's just immediately going around. And maybe if I do something else first, then this is not what he's doing, so now I can do the Schielhau. I mean, those are all the questions you have to figure out about each individual opponent each time you're fencing, if you want to pull off those great techniques in the end where people around you start clapping or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and I kind of also feel like that's where, like, if you're fencing structurally with really good body mechanics, like, and you're sort of leading again with those hips and those shoulders, and like even the pause that you give in your step, like that sort of mentality of like kind of building into your cuts and allowing the body to kind of work all together, as Lichtenauer says, that's sort of the crux of the idea, right? Like there's still a sort of a pause point. You're making your purposeful change, right? The frequens modus is a purposeful change. You're making that purposeful changes and you're coming to a strong position. So you're using the 5 words, and then whether, if they decide to cut off and go around, then they're weakening, and you can strengthen into their weakening action by going with a sphere cow. If they continue to weaken and they try to finish their strike, then you're in a strong position, and now, that satisfies the sort of the taker, and now you can give a hitter sort of notion if we're talking about Meyer.
Yeah, what I like about the Schielhau is that it's super flexible. Like the Schielhau, on the contrary, would not be as flexible, but you can do the Schielhau in different ways against different things your opponent can doing. Like he's doing an Oberhau, a downward strike, the main thing. But also if he's standing in long point, if he's standing in Flug, in Plow. And I'm describing 2 main starting points for the Schielhau. One would be the classic over the shoulder, Hut vom Tag kind of guard. And that's a good starting point to learning it. But if you know the mechanics, you can cheat a little bit by starting in long point with the other foot forward. And then you're actively laying a trap. Like I describe it, you have the point forward and then you take it away, like not threaten with the point directly, but then bring it back, only very briefly opening a window of opportunity. And you can get your opponent to attack in that, what he sees as a window of opportunity when your point is offline. Like if you don't just take it offline and keep there, but open, close. And then you can kind of reduce the moment of attack of your opponent, and you also kind of can guess what he's doing because you kind of can present your head. So you know what he's likely to attack and when he's likely to attack. And also because you're in long point, your blade is already closer to him. So if you take those together, you can cheat a little bit, and you do not need to go the whole way to your shoulder for the Schielhau. You can just pull it back a little bit and then immediately go forward again, because you do not need, you can reach a very stable structure just from here if you get the basic idea right and you already can do it. But because you have nailed down so many different things that could throw you off, you can finish. You can start from a point where it's nearly finished, basically, and that's also something. This is a tactical choice. Like I cannot just randomly do this. I need to know that okay, I have certain advantages, but I need to be doing certain things to get to a point where I can do it safely. And it's the same thing if you're starting from the shoulder. You're so far back, so if you want to get some reaction from your opponent, see what he's doing, you need to bring your hands forward, because otherwise he'll think, he's super far away, not doing anything, like whatever.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Like I've always kind of thought of I've come to the notion to think that, like, if you think about fencing like a conversation, if you and I were having a debate rather than a conversation, the general process of a debate in the Western world is usually like I would make my opening statement, you would make your opening statement, and then you would react to my opening statement and sort of give a rebuttal, and then I would take whatever your rebuttal was, and then I would make a sort of some sort of a play off of that, right? That's sort of the way that we generally hold debates. But the idea is it's very conversational, right? Vigiani makes this observation that German fencing is like basically like taking turns. He's actually kind of complimentary of German fencing at some points, and then he's also derides German fencing at some point.
Okay.
He would have been, he would have been very familiar with it, right? Because he was an imperial captain. But it is super interesting because, like, if you break it down in that sense and kind of relate it to the idea of dialogue, you know, if you and I are in a debate and then all of a sudden, rather than addressing my points that I've made, you just started kind of talking past me and trying to drive home
just
a
screaming
point or
over
something
you.
like that. Yeah, you would lose, right? Like everybody would be like, that guy's not, you know, he's kind of, that's usually in the impression that most people get in a sort of in a debate where they're like, that guy's an asshole, right?
Yeah. Also, the more important thing is I stop listening to what you have to say, and even if you make an error or whatever, I will not recognize it because I'm not in the tune. I do describe this as a metaphor in the book that if one of you is not listening to the other person, it's just screaming over you, it's just talking over you. You cannot, for example, feint if your opponent does this. If he doesn't react to anything you're doing, forget feints. It will not work.
Right.
And that's kind of the thing. To be able to fence well, you need to somewhat react to your opponent, but also your opponent needs to react to you, because otherwise it's hard to do it safely. But then again, you cannot react too much because then you're opening yourself. So this becomes this whole conversation between liars where both of us are smooth talking the other and saying, oh, of course, I'm open here. Just attack. What's the worst that could happen? Just try it out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because it's also kind of like how I perceive a buffel, right? Is like the buffel is the person who is not listening to you at all. They're just they're just on their own path. They just decide that they're going to come in and do whatever it is that they're going to do and kind of expect it to work, right? So what I see a lot of with the sort of single time actions that we were talking about earlier with like sort of the early interpretations of KDF, while they have their place, they're usually something that you would do if like you're actually listening to what your opponent is doing, and then you come back with that snappy one-liner, right? That just like kind of checkmates their position, right? Yeah. Right. But if I do that from the very beginning and I just like come out and I just throw snappy one-liners, right?
Won't work.
You know,
you need to have the right context for that one-liner to work.
Exactly. I've got to set you up, right? And so, like, I feel like that's where, like, there's sort of this buildup in fencing. And when they say that the Schielhau breaks the buffel, that's kind of what I feel like you're doing. And I think the best way to do that is, you know, you have to sort of absorb whatever it is, and then you have to address the point of the fact that your opponent isn't listening to what it is that you're doing, right? So let's say I do seize the vor, and my opponent decides that they're just going to cut in on a line because, or maybe we both act at the same time, right? So maybe we're technically both acting as buffels, where neither of us really kind of got a good read at the very beginning. We both think offense, right?
I mean, those things can happen. You just should try to avoid them happening.
Right. Yeah. You should try to avoid them, right? You should try to get a better read before you give an attack. But let's say that it does happen. You know, in that case, or maybe you did sort of have that sense of priority. I don't want to use that term. I use that very broadly. Let's say that you did have that sort of sense of priority, and your opponent just didn't listen. And so they kind of moved at the same time, not recognizing that perhaps they were in a disadvantaged position. You know, that in and of itself would lead to a double, or could lead to a double if you don't address it properly. But if you were to recognize that because you're acting first and you're paying attention to whatever tempo your opponent gives in your movement, right? You're still watching your opponent in your movement.
Exactly, yes.
If you recognize that they've done something like that, then you can change it into a shot.
Okay, that kind of scared me a little bit.
Sorry about that. Yeah,
I do agree with your basic assessment of the buffalo, that this is someone who is not super technically fencing, because otherwise he would just be a good fencer who might hit strong. We do have those in the community, but you need to have that part where it's where you don't react super well to whatever your opponent is doing. You're just trying to force whatever you're doing. But I do also think that part of the buffalo thing, or at least it can be, is that this might be someone who, by choice or by not being able to do otherwise, tries to hit hard. Because if you lack tactics, what do? You just hit harder and try to just force your way through your opponent's parry or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's a nice thing that you can do with the Schielhau, because you can start it so early. You can just hit your opponent way before they are able to build up all that momentum with your sword. And it doesn't matter how strong they are. If you just get them early enough and get that blade in position to a point where even if they finish their strike, it's just like at a first third of the way of their strike, they're stopped. They cannot build up that much momentum. And I always felt that with some of the other techniques, if you had someone that just hit like a truck, it always felt a little bit like, kind of able to stop it, but it still feels a bit dangerous, because if I mess up just a little bit, I still get hit. Or with something like the Schielhau, if I got the angle wrong and he pushes my blade down, I might injure my thumb or whatever. And I do not have that with the Schielhau. I've used it many times against people, and usually what happens if the more they want to hit me and the stronger they throw their strike, and the more they step forward, they just end up impaling themselves harder on the Schielhau.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, it's your choice. You can go super hard, but then you're also getting stepped super hard.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not even that those are certain people that are only buffaloes or not, but sometimes if you get people just annoyed or angry or impatient enough, they behave like that. Like you can get someone who is otherwise a competent fencer, get him annoyed enough for the judge or whatever, they don't say anything, and then suddenly they have those buffalo attitude where they go, and now I'm doing one really big visible strike, I'm going forward a lot, and then suddenly you have that. And you have to recognize when that is, and like what is the state of mind that your opponent is in at the point.
Yeah, it certainly, I can quote Manciolino, I think, for everything. But he recommends that as a tactic, right? So he says that you should strike the same strike 3 or 4 times at your opponent to get them to give you a similar strike, right? You kind of talk about irritating your opponent.
Kind of the revenge strike thing.
Yeah, kind of conditioning them. And you discuss that in the book in the tactics section too, right? Sort of encouraging people not to try to hit people with the same technique if they got hit with that technique.
It doesn't work out. Like, you do not do the revenge strike unless that's your main strike and you just kept it back because you felt sorry for the other guy. Just don't do it.
Yeah, which is something that, again, this is something that I really enjoyed about the book, and I think you did a really good job of kind of outlining the overall tactics and sort of the strategic nature of kind of getting a feel for different opponents and how that can affect and sort of change your utilization of the Schielhau. It's interesting, like when the book first came out, I think everybody's reaction was, how did this guy write 140 pages about the Schielhau?
Yeah, it's the same for me. I did not plan initially to write nearly 200 pages on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, it's but I think the really interesting thing, and I think what's really important about this book and why I think I would recommend it to a lot of people, is because I think that this book has something for everybody. So whether you're a beginner, I think your discussion of body mechanics and stepping and sort of, creating structure is such a good discussion for beginning fencers that, I would recommend it to anybody who wants to pick up a longsword. It's a book that I would have absolutely just lived by in the first couple of years of doing HEMA, because it would have changed a lot. And so, but at the same time, when you get into the deeper aspect of tactics and strategy, there's some really good stuff in there about sort of like getting a read on your opponent and recognizing how your opponent wants to fence that I think are invaluable.
Yeah, so with the structure of the book, I tried to front load the content. So, there are some books that have like preamble and then a couple of voices and then some intro, and you like 50% in the book and still did not give any good advice here.
Yeah.
And I tried to go the other end. Like, even if you just read the first 2 or 3 chapters, you should get a lot of stuff out of it. I think you should read everything eventually. It might be at a different point in time than when you started it. But if you read the first things, there should be something in there for you, like some little details you missed. And you should, because this is a book about Schielhau, you should know how to do the Schielhau. But of course, it's not only a book about the Schielhau, it's a book about longsword in general, but always with the Schielhau as an example. So you have something where you can actually try out all of these things, and you have all those little puzzle pieces fitting together and in an environment where you can try it. And oftentimes, even if you have perfect structure, doing the Schielhau at the wrong time is still the wrong technique. And those usually boil down to a choice of tactics and strategy, and who am I fencing? How am I fencing? What is my mindset? How am I going into this? And I mean, when I wrote the book, the first edition, and did some beta reading, you try to get to a point where, or at least I do, where I ask the people afterwards, okay, so if I have to take out 10-15%, which parts do you think you can take? I should take out? And at the beginning, the first couple of versions, they were like, oh yeah, I can take this out, and then I looked over it, and eventually I removed most of the stuff. But there was a point where people are like, I don't see anything they can remove here because everything fits so well together. It makes a lot of sense to have all of it. And people were especially fond of the tactics and strategy chapters, which I was not expecting as much initially, but they were like, yeah, I have not read anything like this ever before, specifically for longsword, and keep it in it. Like, I have not understood everything. Maybe I'm a new offenser, but this is so valuable. Definitely keep them in it. So yeah, that's when I knew that I was kind of on the right path, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's, I guess any good communicator, right? Like, the whole pursuit of mastery, right? Whether we have masters in the modern world or not, a lot of the Bolognese authors talk about what it is to be a master, and their definition of what a master is, or somebody who is essentially someone who can communicate in a way that, gives substance. And it's a teacher, like a master was a teacher. And I'm not trying to obfuscate here and say that you're a master. I don't know you that well, but I don't know.
You have to be careful in our community calling yourself a master.
But the idea is that, if you have sought some sense of mastery in something, right? You've really tried to master a technique, and you've been on that journey of trying to master a technique. Then that's a key aspect of it is being able to communicate effectively and at different levels, right? And that's one thing that I think that you did masterfully in the book, is you communicated to different levels with a lot of different notions. The notion that you have your tactics and strategy that are not just specific to the Schielhau, but are really just specific to longsword fencing, and that can relate anyone into what they're doing. But also, again, that description of body mechanics and getting people fencing the right way with their entire body. I think that'll go a long way towards the community writ large probably fencing better, right? Because that's that's our goal, right?
Yeah. I took a huge risk when I wrote a book because, as far as I know, I'm the first one who write a HEMA book about just one technique. Like, it's more than one technique, but this one technique is foremost and central to everything that's in the book. And you never know, do people actually want to read such detailed deep dives or not? Is there a community here? Will people buy the book, read the book? Or is this like people making 3 memes, but no one buys it? You never know. So I'm kind of happy that when I released the German version 1.5 years back, it was already pretty well received. And the English version was released at the end of January. And it seems to be also well received. So yeah. I mean, that's the ultimate goal here, that people have a shortcut to fence better, like the kind of stuff that I, as you said, would have liked to have back in the day when I started, where you have to figure out the most basic stuff, and then suddenly someone told you some little detail and everything clicked together, and it's like, okay, I see this little detail here makes not only this technique better, but the 5 other things I'm doing at the moment, if I just can apply it here, and then suddenly you're fencing 10% better just by getting one insight that was relevant for you at the time.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think that's just it, right? There's, it really, I think it will make their whole of fencing better.
One thing I have not talked about was after I started HEMA, at some point I realized that I knew nothing about wrestling, and I started training judo, and then after a while I cross-trained in jiu-jitsu, and then I did jiu-jitsu a bit longer than judo. So all in all, I did like 2 years of judo and 2 years of Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Like not 4 times a week, just on the side to HEMA. I'm not super like an expert here. But what I realized then is I learned the same techniques in BJJ that I learned in judo, but the level and the details in BJJ made them like 5 times more effective. Like they were easier to apply. They worked much more reliably. The whole framework with the position before submission and so on, it meant it was much safer to do them because you were always safe, and even if you failed, usually you could recover from that. And that made a huge impression on me that really the devil is in the details. It's not just like swing your sword roughly in that direction and that's good enough, but that kind of set me on the journey to figure that out, and I always ask myself, how can I do this better? Like if I need to improve this 10%, do I take the hands a little bit to the left, to the right, higher, lower? What does that change? When is that good? When is that not good? And yeah, that's kind of the view I have on fencing here, and I met a lot of amazing people who kind of have a similar approach of thinking, like Arto Farmer and his Schielhau. It's really good at body mechanics and so on. Yeah, and that's really what I'm trying to convene here. All those little things I found for myself that are considered to be shortcuts, or some of them even necessary, but people still like. It's hard to figure those things out for yourself. Like you can do it, but it takes a lot of time. And if you just get someone to teach them to you, or in this case to write it so you can just read it, I think that's a big shortcut.
Yeah. I mean, Arto Farma is one of my favorite fencers. And the reason why I love his fencing so much is because of the way that, the way that he focuses on making sure that he's in control of the opponent's sword. Whether it's through body mechanics with giving a Meisterhau, or if it's just kind of fencing his way into a point where he can go for a grapple, because the man, has, I think, disarmed every human being on earth at this point. He's really good at it.
And he has just such a good body structure. So even though with other people you can see something and think, I can just strike through that. No, his blade will not move an inch. It stays right where it is, because the body structure supports it. So, and that's if you do that, you can suddenly like if you match everything perfectly, fencing feels suddenly effortless. Like it's super easy to just, if you get everything right, and if you don't, then suddenly everything feels hard. You need to use more force, you're more tired, but the more effective you fence, the more effortless it feels. Kind of a dichotomy here, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. And the longer you can fence too, right? Because I think, you always hear people complain about their arms, their forearms, their elbows, that's one of the things that, one of the points that I made in that article that I wrote recently about interpretation is, the way that you move your body should be proportional to the weapon in hand, right? Like if I was to try to use an epee and I was to try to just, or let's say I picked up a longsword and I'm an epee fencer and I try to, go out there and just flitch all the time with a longsword. I just took a I don't know, like maybe 500-gram weapon and turned it into a, I don't know, 2,000-gram, maybe 3,000-gram weapon, you know?
Doesn't match, doesn't work.
It doesn't work, right? Eventually, it's gonna overstress your tendons in your body in such a way that you're probably gonna have systemic long-term injury. So you have to sort of pair the form with the tool in use, and I think that's really important from a longevity perspective, but it's also how fencing should be done. I mean, there's kind of a reason why they tell you to do those things, you know?
Yeah.
When the anatomy bolognese tells you to make a half turn of the hand followed by a half turn of the body with a half turn of the foot, you know, there's a reason for that.
Yeah, I think again with the Schielhau it becomes super obvious, because if you do not turn your upper body and you just do it from the hands, it's very easy to overstretch your front hand. And you can do that a couple of times and not feeling it, but do that a couple of weeks, and yeah, this takes like 6-8 weeks to go away if you started it, even if you relax everything in here. And it's just so damaging. You can at many points just overdo it and try to get that half-inch more reach, but then completely break your body structure, overstretch your ligaments, tendons, wrists, whatever. Yeah, it's a shame, but you can get away with this sometimes, but it just accumulates over time.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is like kind of going back to the body mechanics, or like kind of fleshing this out a little bit with the body mechanics, is like if you imagine, so like you do a really good job describing ox in the sort of the arms extended position, right? Like the way that your body moves, the way that your body is intended to move, is that you're chaining different muscle groups to sort of come together to move whatever object it is. Yep. That you need to move. And if you rely on smaller muscles, your actions might be a little bit faster, but you're going to overstress them if you're trying to get them to move something. But from those structured positions, you're also chambered to give another action. So, one of the things that you see a lot in Bolognese fencing. So like in Marazzo and Manciolino, they have the same notion of frequens modus that's in 3227A. So if you think about frequens modus as sort of that idea of purposeful change, but also acting en des, there's the same notion is built into, or is described by Marazzo and Manciolino, where they talk about how you want to renew your action before your opponent becomes settled in guard. Right. So if I were to think that arm extended position, let's say my opponent is going up into ox, I would want to renew my attack before they get into that structured position. Right. And the reason why is because when somebody finishes that guard transition, they're in a strong position, like they're in a structured position. And from a structured position, you can react with a good action out of that, right? Like your whatever sort of terminal action follows that is going to be a quality cut in some way, or a quality action that could provide, disruptive.
And also you're mentally just ready. Like if you wanted to go there for some reason, if you end up there, you're ready to do whatever is next. Just if you meet someone halfway there, then you might not be as ready.
Yeah, and so if you end up with like smaller muscles, and going back to that Schielhau, like if you're throwing a Schielhau and you are just using your wrists, there's a really good chance that the tip's going to go too far. And at that point, you're not in control of your weapon. Like your weapon is in control of your hands, right?
Basically.
So like that's where you see people like overstriking and fencing like a buffel, basically, right? Because they're not in control of their body. They don't have their body mechanics behind their weapon. So they're overextending. You see, I think about this every time somebody's in a tournament. I do it. I still do it. Like, I mean, I've been doing HEMA for almost a decade now, and I still find myself on occasion like overstriking and then not cutting to a guard position. And it bothers me every time I do it. I get so mad at myself. But
I mean, you can get away with it, because if you're close enough, if you just move the blade in a strike into your opponent's direction, you will hit something. Like it might be the arms, head, feet, whatever. If you're close enough, you will hit something, and then you're thinking, "Oh, this is working, so this is what I'll do." But if you do not have any precision, how would you replicate something you did well? Like you'd realize, okay, this is going well, I'm doing this again. But if you cannot replicate whatever you're doing because your strikes are all over the place, you just this will not work. So I think that's also something that you realize rather quickly in rapier fencing. In rapier, you have to be a lot more precise if you do the stabbing, because the margin of error and the window of opportunity are just usually smaller than a longsword, for example. And you suddenly realize that, okay, this is a weapon that is really hard to fence unless you have some precision. While longsword, it can take you a couple of years until you realize, okay, this is not doing it for me. I've kind of it kind of went with the flow, but I need to really work on that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of the thing, I think that relates back a little bit to the Schielhau, is that, again, sort of the idea that your body is transitioning through positions, even if you're kind of going into a striking position. Like there are two set positions that you're going through. Right, you're kind of coming to that sort of crossing where you've got that 30 to 45 degree angle, and you're sort of inviting them down into the cross guard of your sword, and then you're pushing the hands forward to kind of come and drop that long edge, or the short edge, into the pocket, or you call it the triangle, and so like that to me is also kind of beneficial to think about in terms of, like, again, to prevent yourself from overstriking. If you're kind of thinking that there are endpoints of every action, and even if you break it down into smaller bits and you have like A position, B position, regardless, if you're thinking about fencing in a positional way, then that allows you to prevent yourself from overstriking or overextending, right? Like you're always
and you also have to think about what's the first part of me and my weapon that needs to be in what position. Like usually it's not the body that needs to be in the range of the opponent first, but it needs to be your weapon at some point between you that is advantageous to you. And now the question becomes, if I'm at that point without stepping, is it still a good position? If the answer is yes, then probably you can just delay the step a little bit and feel your opponent out. Or, sometimes it might be, again, with the Schielhau, if you just do the Schielhau, start from the shoulder, go around, oftentimes you just get hit in the hands, because the hands is in the middle, in the center between you, before the rest of you, the blade is there. And it's the same thing with Schielhau. If you do it, you could do it in a way where you just push your hands forward without doing changing anything with the orientation of the blade. Well, then just your hands are in between your body and the opponent, and if your opponent is a bit faster than you assumed, you just get hit in the hands. That's not the thing here. So you need to think about what's the first thing that needs to be there, and how do I get it there as fast as possible, and what are the parts of my body mechanics that have a little bit of leeway that I can vary, and bringing the blade to that point, especially if the other person is chambering a strike or ready for a strike, that's usually not negotiable. Now, if he's in the guard and is just chilling around, it doesn't look like he's striking immediately, then again, you can move it halfway and see and go back and then go the full way. You can try out things like that. But you need to know what kind of situation am I finding myself in, and what are the things that are really important. Like I think that's the basic thing here. What is really the most important thing for each given technique? Like what is central here? What do they really need to do? What it is boils down to, and what is nice to have, and what are the central points?
No, I definitely agree with that. So now that I've done enough praising of the book, and I really do encourage everybody to pick up a copy. And I'm not saying that because I'm biased, because you sent me a copy. I actually mean it. I think it's really good. But I do want to read some dissenting opinions. So let's see. So some of the feedback that I got from folks who had read the book and had some questions. One of them said, so you kind of insulate your interpretation with the notion that it's okay to disagree. So let's look at some of the areas where people do disagree. In Dierk Hagedorn's translation of Danzig, he translates strike long against his stroke with the short edge with outstretched arms above against his stroke, above over his sword to his head. I think where people find difficulty accepting your interpretation is that the strike should be long with the short edge with the outstretched arms, specifically focusing on strike long, where yours is shortened, and with the short edge, which yours starts with the long edge. So that's one sort of critique.
So I guess the follow-up questions would be, what exactly would someone consider long, and what do you consider short? So, I mean, yeah, it says in the text in the early Lichtenauer sources that you're verkürzt, so shortened, if you will have your hands angled like you're in ox or pflug or plow. That's where you have your hands shortened. Now, if you look at the pictures, the hands are forward by quite a bit. Now, is this apparently for this person it's not long enough, but it begs the next question, like, for example, long point. What is long point? Because there's also some kind of discussion. And I do not think that in long point it's just put out the hands straight and that's it, but you can have a bit of an angle. Like, you can move your hands up, down, and still have them pretty far extended, and that would be still long point. So I would consider those arms to be long and not short, but yeah, I can see the point. So if you do not define it differently, that's a fair point to make.
Yeah, so I think to build on that, I think one of the other sort of critiques is that this didn't actually come about your book. This was actually me talking to a very close friend of mine and them giving me critical feedback on my interpretation of the Schielhau, was that they said that it sounded to them more like a Kronhau, so like Meyer's Kronhau, where he goes into a Kron position before sort of dropping the short edge down on the opponent. So very similar overall mechanically, right? Because you're kind of going into a Kron position and then, pushing the arms forward. And the counter to that is because you're shortening before you come forward versus it being in a long position, so you're going with the arms outstretched, first of all, is that you're giving the opponent time to see that you're going into a shortened position, and therefore they can basically just give up on their Oberhau and then cut up underneath your hands, which is the general recommendation for if somebody starts to cut short at you.
I mean, so the way I do the Schielhau, let's look at it by individual body parts. So my right hand, I'm a right-hander, so the right hand is at a crossguard. What I'm doing during the Schielhau is I'm just moving it forward, but not just forward in a straight line, so not on my right side, but it crosses my body to the left side. So I'm not stopping with the hand, it's just one straight motion forward while crossing my body. And I do have my right hand pretty much extended at the end. So I do not think that I stop at some point, like not with this hand. And I could not move it forward anymore. I can bring it down to the center. That would bring the point of the blade a bit further forward, but then I'm completely open to the head. So I'm the maximum extended while still having the blade on, like in front of the left shoulder, basically, the hilt. And the funny thing is, when I had those discussions in real life, people sometimes go like, yeah, but isn't this just like strike whatever, but with a different edge? So for example, isn't this just like a Twerhau with a short edge to the other shoulder, or isn't this just like a Sonhau with the short edge, or isn't this whatever? And I think you can argue that, of course, and you can come to different conclusions, but you kind of can say that about all of the strikes. Like, isn't the Kruppau just a Twerhau that you do in front of you instead of to the head? Isn't the Zornhau just a Scheitelhau that you do to the lower Hängen? Is it? And I think that's kind of the point here. So if you do it long enough and you study those things, it becomes kind of samey. Like you figure out the body mechanics and that there's more overlap than there is division between the different cuts. And sure, they do all fill their own niche, but it's not like it's something completely crazy going on in one chapter and then something completely different. But they share a core, and that's kind of what makes up the system here.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting though, and sort of, I think what you're getting at here as well, right, is if I was trying to thrust at somebody in rapier, I would want to have some sort of a counter guard first, right? Like I would want to have some sort of a counter posture of an overbind over top of them before I came forward with my point. Right, like there are free thrusts in rapier and side sword, but for the most part, you want to have control of your opponent's sword first. And what actually strikes the opponent in most rapier traditions is an action of the feet. Right, so you think about the lunge, but even in Bolognese fencing, there's usually a step or something like that. Once you have control of your opponent's weapon, that actually allows for your weapon to strike your opponent. And it's really fascinating in Vigiani. Stephen Freitas just did a translation of books 1 and 2 of Vigiani. And one of the things that Vigiani talks about in book 1, which, I don't know why everybody said that it wasn't worth translating, because there's some really good fencing advice in there. But one of the things that he gives is basically the virtues of a fencer. And Vigiani's virtues of a fencer, he talks about how, so like you think about the Segno, like Paulus Cal's Birdman, or Fiore's virtues of a fencer, or Vadi's virtues of a fencer, right? Vigiani actually gives his own virtues of a fencer. And one of the really interesting things is he talks about how self-control in fencing is done with the feet. So his virtue of the feet is self-control. Which is kind of fascinating, right? Like you think about, again, like there's obviously kind of self-control, like we've been talking about structure with the hands and everything like that, and you can kind of overextend, but his idea is that like you can really tell the control of somebody by watching their feet. I think that that's true, right? Like you can see when somebody's sort of overzealous and thinks that they're going to land a strike, they overstep or they overextend in some way, versus being sort of prudent or moderate with the way that they're stepping.
Yeah, or even sliding into their step instead of just doing a step and then that's it.
Right, exactly. So there's sort of this notion of how like the combination of the body overall and its movement and things like that is really kind of predicated on this sense. And like the way that you're sort of describing going through the Schielhau, again, like with the step, the way that you sort of break it down, where like you are coming with those arms extended to sort of catch, and then the body is sort of turning, but it's the finish of the step that actually drives that point home, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
So there's sort of a decision point there. There's that sense of self-control and temperance that is available to you through the modification of that step. Because if your opponent moves indes of your Schielhau and starts to attack on a different line or do something else, you can change, right?
So I want to end up at the same point. That this is again about precision. Like if I can do the Schielhau as a cut or as a thrust. So if I do it as a thrust, let's say I want to aim for the chest, at the center, sternum, chest, somewhere like that. And if that is the point where I want to end up at, I want to be there, and it should not matter if my opponent, like if I'm catching somewhat downward strike, I want to end up there. Or if the opponent is standing in plow and I want to get there at the same point, or in Langort. So it should not matter if I have a bind or not, if I get a strike or not. I should be able, because my body structure is so good and I have all the details down, that I just very precisely end up always at the same point where I want to be. or end up with my point at the target. And yeah, that's also the thing. If you're not precise enough, but also not controlled enough, like you're just all over the place. And sometimes you're stabbing your opponent in the head and in the forehead, sometimes in the chest, sometimes in the throat. And that's not really the best thing to do in fencing. You want to be in control of what your weapon does and not your weapon in control of you. Or worst, your temper in control of what you're doing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's go to... Yeah, go ahead.
Just coming back to the Kronhaus thing, I mean, Meyer does take an existing system and just subdivides it, so it's entirely possible that this is actually a Kronhaus in Meyer, and because he has a Schielhau, and I also talk about it, and it's a little bit different from what I'm doing, so I'm not that familiar with Meyer, so that could be the case here. I mean, for the overall system, Meyer has a lot of nice advice on tactics. I just think that the approach with the guards and with the cuts is a bit too let's say, he divided it up too much. So, for example, with the Glützhau and the Knichelhau and so on, we had people over here for seminars and they did the one technique first and then the other, and it looked like, okay, what is the difference here? Oh, the one goes like this and the other goes like this. Yeah, okay, this is like 10 degrees and this is something different. Yeah, according to Meyer it is. Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it's possible, but I'm not a Meyer guy. I'm a Lichtenauer guy. And I think the system is a bit simpler. There's a lot of stuff that sources do not talk about, unfortunately. But the overall approach is just more reduced, more boiled down to like, you have Schrankhut, sure, but this is just a variation of Alba. And you have other positions that are just variations of each other, and you kind of get some broad advice about those positions. It's just not like, I do not subdivide it into 3 different positions where I go over each of them and what you do from one or the other. You just figure that part of yourself, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, Marazzo has the same problem. He decides to name a whole bunch of things and then, he's not as descriptive as Meyer. Meyer's a much better author overall than Marazzo is, but Marazzo in particular likes to create his own terminology, where somebody like Manciolino would basically just describe it as is. He would just say, I don't know, cut a mandrito fendente that crosses the opponent's sword, whereas Marazzo would call it a mandrito traversado. And so there's, in some ways, like in technical language, like having an explanation or at least something that's a little bit more direct would be more beneficial rather than having, coming up with technical jargon. Sometimes technical jargon overcomplicates things, right? And I think that's, in a lot of ways, what Meyer is doing, is creating a whole bunch of technical jargon.
Yeah, I mean, you can say I have 20 techniques more than the next guy. It's just that, is it useful to differentiate or just say, he has 3 variations of the same technique, just use them whenever you feel like it, because it depends, like if your opponent strikes a bit higher, lower, or at a different angle or whatever. And just because also mentally it's just like, oh yeah, do this technique and it just adapt it to the situation, and instead of thinking, oh, I did technique A, but I should have really done technique B, when they're really kind of the same thing, just at a different point.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, again, that kind of goes back to the idea that, like you're seeking the principle within, right? So in KDF, the principles that you're always looking for are sort of an application of the 5 words, since they're the fundament of all fencing. And you're trying to sort of suss out how each action, each follow-up action, or even the response from the opponent are in relation to those 5 things. And that's where it gets pretty interesting with like technical jargon, is that in some ways it could be beneficial to kind of help illustrate multiple examples of like variation and potential variation and how you might react to elements of potential variation. But it's such a deep level to get to that there has to be some sort of pre-existing knowledge of what it is that you're doing to really kind of understand it. And I think that's where the simplicity of the KDF system is actually kind of beautiful. Even with authors like Marazzo and Manciolino, there's this notion of nominalism defense. A lot of times you're not really told like what sort of variation your opponent is giving you in their attack. It's either just a cut from the right or a cut from the left, right? It's a mandrito or a reverso. And the notion is that you don't have time to really kind of differentiate and think about
no,
what it is that your opponent is doing. Yeah, you exactly. You have to feel it, right?
I mean, that's the thing. You can also not describe all of those situations, all of those variations. There's just too much. At some point, as an author now or back then, you have to break it down to some general ideas. Like, if someone generally does something that look like this, you can do this against it, and doesn't matter if it's like a little bit faster, a little bit slower, a little bit higher, a little bit, like there's some point where it's a completely different technique and then you should react differently, but there's a whole lot of spectrum where this still works and where this still applies. That you cannot always say, oh, and by the way, this is not only for this exact case but also for these 10 things that are adjacent to it.
It always makes me think about there was a lecture that was given at Long Point many years ago by Jake Norwood, and he basically uses a very nominalistic approach to create OODA loops to like differentiate between the guards. I don't know if you've ever seen that lecture, but it's really good. I mean, it's that sort of that notion of kind of reducing fencing down to its basic concepts is really fascinating. You see a lot of different attempts at that throughout, the hundreds of years that we have record of fencing being taught, and we know exactly how it was taught, and it seems like it's something that cropped up time and time again, where every once in a while you would have an inspired author who would just say, screw all the technical jargon. That's what Viggiani is. He's just like, why do we have guards that are named after animals? Can we just say what the guard actually does?
I mean, you even see that nowadays, like in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you have hundreds of different positions, guards, attacks, if you combine all of it. And the thing is, like, you're going through different phases, and at some point you just absorb all of it, you try to get your knowledge out there, but then afterwards you're like, oh, most of them share some common principles, so that's kind of the thing here. And then when you understand this, you're like, it's not like a surprise weapon where you just can say, I found the newest thing. Sometimes it works. I'm not that high level BJJ, but according to the discussions I see and the videos and so on. But it sounds like kind of the same thing. The overall, there's too much to do, too many different ideas, but you kind of boil it down to a core where you can apply to different approaches. And if you see something new, it kind of makes sense in your world and your game, where you can say, okay, this is kind of a variation of this and this and that, and can be used in the same situations.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm a firm believer in the sense that, all of fencing, whether you're doing KDF or Bolognese fencing or Fiore or Vadi, can really be broken down with the same core principles across. Like, I mean, the same rules that dictate whether or not you're successful are going to be the same rules that dictate whether I'm successful. And we might call them by different names, and we may have different ways of approaching it, but for the most part, they're all the same.
I think it makes sense to have different systems because different people kind of sort it differently, think about it differently, and name things differently. And that's fine, because also if you're studying it, some systems might click with you and others might not. But in the end, it's just a lot of common ground, even to something like Olympic fencing. Even if there's kind of a meme thing and people make fun of one or the other, there's still just such a huge overlap when it comes to distance management, footwork, and so on. Even the context is completely different.
I mean, one of the things that inspired me to get into HEMA in the first place was I was reading about I guess it was a dukedom at the time, the dukedom of Württemberg, because that's where my family was from in Germany. And so I was just kind of reading about the history of the area, and I started reading about Eberhard Eimbart, and I found out that he had a sword master, and I thought that was so cool. And so I started looking into it. That was kind of in parallel with my journey of getting into HEMA. But that originally brought me into like studying and wanting to study KDF. But when I actually got into HEMA, the thing that really grabbed me and that I kind of ran with was Bolognese fencing. And now, 10 years later, that's sort of my niche. So you never know where it's going to take you. But like you said, different things speak to different people, and you kind of find your area of study and focus. And, now that I've come back to KDF in a way, looking at Lignitzer and 133, even though 133 is outside of KDF, though there's definitely some similarities. Interestingly, this is, sorry, I'm digressing and sort of interrupting my own point, but in 133, I actually, my interpretation, this is going to like really piss off 133 sword and buckler people, which is perfectly fine with me. But I think that there's a play from Second Warn, so your sword is up over your shoulder, where he does the, shoot, it's escaping me right now, the Dirk Tretten. The way that he does the Dirk Tretten, and he has this sort of the picture of the inverted hand, and people are always trying to look for some sort of a weird interpretation as to, like, I mean, that's where the saggy tunic theory comes in. I don't know how well you know Martin, but he, so like the inverted hand that he's giving there, I actually think is him basically giving you the option, because a thrust is a possibility there from where he's going to do the Dirk Tretten. So I think that he's basically going to the position that you would consider a Schielhau, and that I consider a Schielhau.
Could very well be, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, if
and
you
that's
want
why
to really,
that's why the hand's inverted.
I mean, if you want to really annoy the I-32 people, you just say 132 and I-32 and alternate between them, so you always annoy one part of the population.
That's funny. But I do think that I think that position is the same as the Schielhau. I think that's what he's potentiating there. And I think with the Dirk Tretten in particular, the reason why he falls down across the hands is because you create separation from the opponent's sword. So you can't thrust if you create separation, but you can definitely slice. And so then you slice down across their sword hand.
I mean, you would definitely expect to see overlap when it comes to techniques when the basic setup of the sword is the same. Sure, the I-33 swords are shorter than long sword, it's one-handed, but still you have the basic setup where you have the cross guard. So yeah, this is a safe position to do, so you should be there. With a rapier, it's different, because with the finger over the cross guard, you are limited in some range of motion, so you would not expect to see a big overlap when it comes to strike, also because at least Italian rapiers are more thrust-oriented than gut-oriented and so on. So there's some difference here, but even then, you can say that some of the rapier's thrusting positions are basically the same position again, just smaller. It's more in the center, not as pronounced, but it's still see the same thing. Like, you can only turn your hand so many ways, I guess.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, in my opinion, you do kind of see a relative Schielhau position. I think Stephen Freitas was just talking about this the other day with the Anonimo Bolognese, how the Anonimo Bolognese does there's some attacks that the Anonimo does from Guardia de Entrare. And the interesting thing about Guardia de Entrare is that it's a position where a lot of times, imagine your hand is down by your hip, so your right hand is down by your right hip, in, let's say, like a Codalunga strata position, so it'd be like a right flug for the
side sword, right?
Audience. Yeah, side sword. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But it even shows up in rapier, and I'll kind of build into that here in a second.
Okay.
But when you do any sort of an attack from with Guardia de Entrare, there's usually some sort of a motion of sort of achieving like a counter find, or an obligare, or another way sort of describe it would be, or I guess a counterguard in Altoni. But you're going to cross your opponent's sword first, and then you would come up with your hand in what like the later rapier authors call an incortada or an incorta thrust. That same position, like if you were to just try to pick somebody's sword up from a low position without actually creating any sort of a crossing over top of their sword, there's a chance that you could catch them in your cross guard, but it's so much more effective if you actually like encourage their sword into your cross guard first with the turn of the body before you extend the hand fully and sort of go into the position whether or not you're stepping back with the right or the left foot to sort of create that position. So it's really interesting. I mean, I do see similarities across the board, right? Like you always want to get control of your opponent's weapon.
I mean, it's just sound advice if someone has some stepping implement.
Yeah, it's good fencing. Okay, all right. So
by the way,
more
you
questions.
mentioned... Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
You just mentioned at the beginning that you wanted to talk about the layout. I was just wondering what you were, in which direction you wanted to take it.
Oh, the layout of the book? Or
I think that's what you said, yeah. So I was just curious what you were going. Where you were going.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I was complimenting the layout overall because I think it's a really beautiful presentation. You know, having black and gold is the theme.
Yeah.
But also in the color version, which is the hardback version of the book, you know, it's really well laid out. It's nice to have, you know, chapter headings. It's not overly wordy by any means, and you provide lots of different points where you want to give sort of notes to kind of help people with sort of helpful advice, but rather than just kind of confusing the main point that you're trying to make, the fact that you kind of just put little notes in sort of gold boxes to allow to just keep the flow of the book rolling is just really nice.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I would like to see from everyone who makes some sword book with pictures and photos in it from now on is show me what is the blade alignment, even if the photo quality is not that good. So I made a little, like I drawn over the images, so you have your own blade and your opponent's blade, and it's in the exact position where you end up with, just in the corner, zoomed in. As a vector graphic, so it's clear outlines, and you can have the worst photocopier ever, and you can still make out what the edge alignment is. Because when I was researching for the book and looking at books I had here, like even with modern books with good photos and color pictures, it's sometimes so hard that you have to go so close to figure out, okay, which edge is in front of which blade and where is to put it. So just please, everyone do this. You can copy it, and the style I did it. I just hope that everyone approaches it like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, I mean, basically what you did is create a modern gloss of the Schielhau, right? Like, I mean, it's right, and that's interesting, because it is important, you know. Like, there's I was talking to Puck Curtis, that's who it was, some time ago, and one of the things that he was talking about, and you know, in his relation of learning fencing and teaching fencing and stuff like that, one of the things that oftentimes doesn't show up is what, you know, even in modern fencing, they would call floor knowledge. And, you know, floor knowledge is something that they might be specific details that would be just sort of known. They would have sort of worked their way in through whatever your basics of understanding were and things like that. And so they get left on the training room floor because, you know, what the author might be trying to convey might be some higher level of knowledge, right?
Just stuff everybody knows and no one talks about.
Right, exactly. You know, I mean, saying that you want to have, you know, the sword fall into the crossguard or, do whatever and have control over your opponent's weapon, they might be like, Lichtenauer said fence with your entire body, so just do that. And, that's done by...
Just do that is a good saying, yeah.
Yeah, just do that. No, but, it might have been inherent, right? Like it might have just been common sense at that point for whoever the author was. And it's like, well, why would I even bother to kind of even detail this in a gloss? Because this is just foundations, right? So you
I even saw that with some people who were just gifted athletically or had a lot of,
Sure.
like they knew their body and they just did things well.
Yeah.
And then you ask them, hey, how are you doing this? Well, I'm just doing it like this. Feels good to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Or they have previous experience in a different martial art, right? Like,
Yeah, also.
like you were saying how, BJJ and judo sort of changed your overall mindset about how the way that you approach looking for techniques and interpretations.
That's kind of the thing. Everything you're doing is changing how you approach certain things and the experience that you're making. So even from that point alone, like I don't want to go into the whole physical difference argument like people 500 years ago, but if you're walking everywhere, riding everywhere, doing some like it's physical
Yeah.
life, and that alone changes how you can do certain things and cannot change, and how you know your body and so on.
Yeah, there's studies that are going on right now, and some of them have been published about how cell phones have changed human anatomy.
Like the thumb movement and mobility.
Yeah, thumb movement and mobility, but also people, looking like this all the time, and just like how does that affect things? Because we sit around and look at computers all day. It's definitely would be in the early stages of any sort of adaptation or sort of natural selection, but still,
we know that that's not the best thing for eyesight, for example.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there are lots of disadvantages, right? Because our bodies are meant to be out and picking up rocks and doing things and being physical. And so, yeah, there's just a different way of thinking about things.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You can see that in the manuscripts. I was having a conversation. I don't know if you know who John Chandler is.
Yeah.
He's a good friend of mine.
Yeah. Not positively, but I follow him.
Yeah. We were having a discussion about how people have a tendency to underestimate sort of Renaissance and medieval people and their intelligence. We were talking about how in the medieval times there was a sort of an industrial revolution that preceded the Renaissance. So in about the mid 13th century, and even before that, there were multiple large-scale industrial operations, mostly through water mills, that allowed for the production of things at such a high level. And this production was like widespread throughout Europe. And most Americans don't know this, but I'm sure that you probably are aware of this. So maybe this is just to my American audience, but we're talking about how people have a tendency to sort of underestimate like the overall capability. But what that related to me and what I think is interesting is I was trying to think of a sword master or a author of swordsmanship, whether they were a master or not, that doesn't have some semblance of a knowledge of sort of the philosophical underpinnings that really kind of drove societal thinking at the time, right? So like in 3227A, you have mention of Aristotle, and Aristotle is fairly prominent in the way that he sort of susses out the 5 words, and you could take that into the rest of the KDF tradition. You read Pietro Monti, and, he goes on this long Galenic breakdown of people and humors and things like that, but he also has some relatively sophisticated ideas in terms of tempo and physics as well, which are probably born from a knowledge of Aristotle. And you see very similar things. I mean, Bob Powers just did a lecture where he broke down how Fiore is really sort of a Euclidean approach to fencing, which is super fascinating. So,
I mean, some of them were teaching princes, so they better show some sophistication if they're hanging out in those circles.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you're Fiore and you're in the court of Milan and your peers are a whole bunch of well-educated knights from the Milanese court, and probably Gian Galeazzo Visconti, or later in life going to the court of Ferrara and spending time rubbing elbows with Niccolo III d'Este, you have to know your stuff, because if you show up and you're an ignorant fool, they're going to be like, get this guy out of here.
Yeah, like this is some bar brawler.
Yeah. But all that to say, there's definitely a sense of keen intelligence and wisdom that's sort of embedded in a lot of the text. Is kind of what I was getting at.
Yeah, I think that is, like, you can say that people were not as educated as we are today because we just learned so much more, but that they are not as smart as us, that would be kind of a stretch. I mean, it depends on nutrition and so on, but still, you had some really smart people back then, and we should not assume everyone to just run around and be an idiot about it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's knowledge, right? Knowledge is information that you can regurgitate, and then there's practical knowledge, or common sense or wisdom, things that you learn through experience in life. If you were to take a modern person out of any modern city and throw them in the woods and expect them to survive, I imagine they would probably be dead within a few days. Very well. Yeah, and you could argue that keeping yourself alive is probably the most important thing. So I don't know. I mean, are they smarter? You could say that the objective of what they could do in terms of intelligence would probably be more valuable.
I mean, context matters here, so you cannot just put this out of context. Like, they were people of their time eventually, and they did the most of it. Everyone wants to live a life. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's important to keep in mind, though, and I think that's kind of what you were getting at, right? Like, I mean, context matters. Whether it's like the physical ability of somebody because of the reality of their day-to-day, or whether it's intelligence or, relative knowledge that is actually important to that specific person.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I feel that some people also in the HEMA scene kind of underestimate how much you can learn just by doing something over and over again, even if you have not the knowledge base to build upon. I mean, that's kind of what we were doing with HEMA. Sure, we had the manuscripts, but they lack often certainly something to be desired and leave gaping holes. We just were bad. Like, we were bad fencers back like 15 years ago or 20 years ago as a whole community, and we improved a lot. How do we do it? Well, we just did it a lot and exchanged with each other, and that's the thing. Also, with if you're learning like a job and you're manufacturing something, or that you're building something with wood or whatever, just do it over and over again for a large enough time frame, and eventually the chances are pretty high that you will be good at that thing.
Yeah.
Practically knowledge, definitely a thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. I got it. I went down that diatribe, and I forgot to finish this. So I'm going to finish asking these dissenting questions, and then we can wrap it up. So one of them was related to something that we talked about earlier. It says that you say that Meyer Schielhau does not protect the hands, but what prevents Meyer Schielhau from having a similar effect to the Zornhau, where you're cutting into your opponent's cut, creating a sort of flat beat and space for the short edge to work into the triangle? If you were to take their weak with the strong and arrest the cut, can't you also work the point end similar to a Mutieren?
I mean, the answer to those kind of open questions is usually yes, you can, but not in every case. I mean, that's a fair point to make here. Can you do it in a safe way? It's just that if you look at how people are doing the Schielhau, and if you look at YouTube videos and also the older ones, that if you have that vertical cross guard, it's just a lot more difficult to protect your hands efficiently, because for like, as soon as the opponent's blade is not under or over your blade where your crossguard is, but at the sides, that the risk is just too high that something goes towards your hands. And the easiest way to avoid this is to change the angle, not have it vertically, but have it more aligned to where the opponent is. So sure, every time you can get the opponent's blade, for example, directly under your short edge or long edge or whatever, and have the crossguard there, then you can do this safely. It's just that this brings different disadvantages. So, for example, against the downward strike, like how would you do that? You can do it with the Sonnenhelm because you go from the top down. If you try it with the Schielhau, it gets difficult, because either you have like your point is pointing offline, or your structure is not as stable, or there are many different things that could be an issue here. It's not that it doesn't work. It's more of a, I think this combination of how to do it has so many advantages that it's not super useful to do it a lot differently. But yeah, for example, I mean, that's the example I'm giving when I'm talking about like how Meyer does a Schielhau. It's not to shit on Meyer per se, but mostly about this, okay, this is probably a different thing that he's describing, and it has some disadvantages, but there's still situations where you can use it. And one of the situations is the opponent's blade does not go into the direction of your hand. It's just like trying to defend, and then sure, like if he's going to some kind of crone position, you can just cut down directly on the top of his head with like a reverse Schielhau, while we are comparing cuts like with a short edge. Yeah, that's the thing you can do, that you can do safely. It's just that if you say, like the chapter on the Schielhau in Meyer is not that long compared to the audio sources, but if you want to do like a Lichtenauer Schielhau that has to fulfill all these other roles as well, like against the long point, against plow and so on, I think that's something that this version has a hard time doing.
Yeah. I agree. Especially against, like, if you think about long point and plow, I think that's really where that sort of exaggeration of sort of throwing the Schielhau, really the way that is described there, really has a tendency to fail a little bit, right? Because if you think about those point forward positions, being able to first pick up the sword from its extended position makes a lot of sense, right? And of course, that's kind of what you're doing when somebody throws an Oberhau anyway, because they should be cutting to long point. So you're kind of interrupting.
Yeah, usually you can either have an easy attack against the guards or have a good counter against the strikes. Just getting both of them together with the same or similar body mechanic, that's kind of the main thing here also with the other strikes, because it's easy to find an interpretation that works for one of those areas, but just if you put them together, sometimes it just doesn't work out that well, and it's a kind of you can pull it off, but it's not the most safe thing to do.
Right. Yeah. And I also think too, like, so, you know, like if you were to, let's say, try to do a Schielhau against somebody who's in long point, and they decided that, you know, I think what somebody would probably say, as to just try to break what it is that you're telling them, is they'd be like, oh, well, I would just perform a Dirkwechsel, right? And the answer to that is, okay, but I'm also watching your sword in the process of giving the Schielhau, and if you perform the Dirkwechsel, then that's okay. I'll just, you know, go strongly back into your sword.
We're back again to if I do the just one movement as fast as I can, I'm stacking me forward with my strike, then yeah, the Dirkwechsel will get me. But if I move the hands first, see what you're doing, and then decide if I commit or not, I can do it. Or I decide to go, you know what, he's doing a Durchwechsel, but that means he doesn't attack me in the moment. I just do something slightly different and attack his hands instead with the same motion. That's something I can also do, but only if I have enough time to react to what my opponent is doing.
Right, and you have to create that time, and that time can be created with the body. Yeah, I like that. Okay, the next one. We did that one. Okay, so the last one. I've had a few left-handed people, sinister folk, contend with the notion that you can't perform the Schielhau from the left against an Oberhau as a left-hander. What's your reasoning for claiming that the Schielhau is rarely worthwhile for a left-hander?
So, if you assume that your opponent is still attacking as a right-hander from his right side and you're doing the Schielhau from your left side, because the Schielhau crosses your body. So if I start as a right-hander, I go from the left shoulder, or I'm in front of my left shoulder and I end up in front of my left... You start in front of the right shoulder, you cross your body, you end up in front of the left shoulder. So you cross the center line. And if your opponent is on the other side, that works pretty well, because then you have the inside line. You have the center between you blocked out and your opponent is on the outside. Now, if your opponent is still attacking from the right side and you're doing the Schielhau as a left-hander from the left side, you're not doing that. You are coming from the outside and you give your opponent the center. And I don't, just to boil it down really simply, I don't think that the Schielhau is the ideal technique in that situation. I think something where you push, because you do not, it's hard to take the center from here. It's not impossible, but you're probably better off doing something differently from here. And I mean, that's the main point I'm making. It's not that this is nothing you can do. You just have to decide. You can say, okay, can I get my opponent to attack from his left side? Because then it's just everything is mirrored. Then that's fine.
Yeah.
And if you're just doing it because you want to learn the Schielhau, that's also fine. It's just if you're thinking, where do I get the most bang for my buck, so to say, maybe not the Schielhau. Maybe something else is a better option here. Because, I'm trying to convey it in a more of a positive way, because what I'm seeing is with left-handers, often they try to do exactly the same thing as right-handers and use the same amount of training time, for example, in a group setting. And that is often detrimental to the development of the left-handers, because while stuff might work out perfectly for the right-handers and might be a nice, like, oh, this is like Schielhau from the right, super important for right-handers, just as an example, and we do that for 2 months at a time, and might be not as relevant for left-handers. And the way I think about it, and I think left-handers should think about it, I do not need to replace it one by one. I do not need to say, okay, then it's Schielhau on the left. I can do something completely differently, and that might be more worthwhile when it comes to learning efficiency. But sure, if you're interested in it, you can do it. It's just you will have a harder time with it.
Well, I think that's interesting, right? Because it kind of gets back into sort of the tactical nature of the action itself, right? Like the tactics and the strategy. Well, the tactics in this case should match the scenario, right? Like the stimulus should match a lot of times. And so because you're flipping your body mechanics basically as a left-handed fencer, again, like kind of what I was talking about with the which hand's on top and which hand is long, you're better off to take any sort of a cut that attacks your right side, so from your opponent's left, and you can set that up in a number of different ways. If somebody strikes an Oberhau, you can do something that's a good defensive action or even a good counterattacking action. You could throw a Sverkow at them,
for example.
And then from that sphere, if they decide to cut around, when you start to throw that sphere and as a counter, then you can Schiel out of your sphere.
Yeah, exactly. So what I wanted to avoid was to have left-handers read the book and not mention anything about this at all, and just get to the right-handers are, oh, this works great, perfectly, and the left-handers are like, why is this hard to pull off? Why doesn't this work? Why do I get the situation not as often? And that's why I put it early. You have to make a decision here. What are you willing to invest? How are you going to approach this? And is this really something that at which point are you in your fencing? Like, what is your goal here? To think about this before you just say, I tried it, but I didn't like it because it doesn't work for left-handers. You can make it work, but then you have to do some other adaptations as well.
Yeah, or just find the tactical scenario, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I think, without getting too far into the weeds, the notion that, everything has to be from like your opening action, whether it's defensive or offensive, whether you're in the vor or in the knock, anybody who's been in fencing knows that you're probably at most going to get about 2 or 3 intentions from an opponent. And what I mean by intentions is like a series of like 3 cuts in succession before they'll probably break measure and decide to do something else, right?
Yeah.
And that's
at least the rhythm
an average.
breaks.
Yeah, if the fencer that's fencing against you is really good, then you might never see the end of it, right? But it does take a higher level of skill to keep up that attacking momentum. So a lot of times you really only ever see maybe 2 or 3. But in those 2 or 3, whether you're offensive or defensive, the opportunity or the scenario is going to come up for you to give that Schielhau at some point. You just have to find the correct moment to give it, which would probably be if the opponent's weapon is, if you're a lefty, if your opponent's weapon is on their left side.
Yep.
So
your setup needs to look different in this case.
Exactly, right? You want to try to set them. You want to take them down that path. Do you like chess?
I don't play it, but
No.
yeah, I mean it's all right.
There was a chess master named Tal, and he was a Russian grandmaster, and he has this quote where he talks about taking the opponent down a deep, dark forest and basically getting them lost there, right? And that's kind of how I think about fencing. Is again, it's conversational. If you want to set up that aha moment, if you want to kind of set up your big point that's just gonna, wow the crowd and just get everybody, say, oh shit. You've got to set it up. You've got to lay the groundwork for it.
Yeah. You need to control the fight. You need to control and know what your opponent will be doing before he knows it himself. And the way you do it is you lay traps. You make certain targets more attractive than others. You reduce the amount of time the window of opportunity. You specifically open that so that you can kind of narrow it down when the attack will come. Yeah. And if all of us, like if I could see in the future doing fencing, just like a second, I could never be beaten because I would always know what you would be doing next. I just need to follow up. And that's kind of the thing you try to do, get a bit of a, like even, it should feel to the other person like you're reading their mind. You're always just one step ahead because you laid the foundation for it. You set a control to the match and then lure them down this dark forest path.
Yeah. And I think that's what's super fascinating. Like if you, I don't know, read any psychology book about really good liars and manipulators, that's basically what their strong point is sort of anticipating your reaction, right?
Yeah.
And that's what makes them really good manipulators, or they can kind of coax you into believing something that they're going to say, and then they can do the same thing over and over again, but still lie to you every single time and then tell you that it's going to be different in some way. And there's always some way of them kind of convincing you that it's going to be so. And that's kind of the way that magic works too, right?
Yeah, the good old talking to your boss technique where you make him think it was his idea all along.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's really good stuff, man. So where can people find copies of your book?
So the Schielhau in detail, Schielhau, is available on Amazon. So you should get it on pretty much all the Amazons there are in your local country. Pretty much worldwide, I think. And it's a self-published over Amazon, so you can only get there. Even if you ask me, I just print it on Amazon and give it to you, so you can just buy it there anyway.
Yeah, and I do highly recommend people get the hardcover version because it is really beautiful. You kind of mentioned in the book that the clarity and the detail would be better with the colored pictures, and but also just the overall presentation of the hardcovers. It's sick. It's a really beautiful book. So
thank you, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. This was really great. Look forward to having more conversations in the future, and hopefully one of these days I'll be out in Germany and maybe we can meet up and do some fencing.
well, let me know.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Alex.